The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the weathered post office in Lyndon, Kansas, and Margaret Nelson could barely suppress another violent cough that tore through her chest like broken glass. She pressed a lace handkerchief to her mouth, feeling the burn in her lungs that had plagued her for the last 3 weeks of travel, ever since she had left Boston in the autumn of 1876. Through the dusty window, she could see the main street of this frontier town, so different from the cobblestone avenues she had known all her life, and she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake accepting the proposal of marriage from a man she had never met. The driver opened the door and extended a weathered hand. Margaret took it, stepping down onto the packed dirt street, her dark green traveling dress already covered in dust, despite her best efforts to remain pristine. Another cough seized her, this one so violent that she had to grip the side of the coach to steady herself. The driver looked at her with concern, his leathery face creasing with worry. "You all right, miss? That does not sound good at all." "I am fine," Margaret managed to say, though her voice came out hoarse and weak. "Just the dust from the journey. It will pass." But she knew it was more than that. The cough had started as a tickle in her throat somewhere in Missouri, then had grown progressively worse with each passing day. She had tried every remedy she could think of, from honey to the medicinal tonics sold at the various stops along the way, but nothing seemed to help. At night, she barely slept, kept awake by the constant hacking that left her exhausted and aching. She looked around the street, searching for the man who was supposed to meet her. According to his letters, Clayton Vance owned a ranch outside of town and raised cattle. He had written that he was 30 years old, hardworking, and looking for a wife to help him build a life on the Kansas prairie. His letters had been kind and honest, describing the challenges of frontier life, but also the beauty and freedom it offered. Margaret, at 24 years old, and facing a bleak future as an unpaid companion to her widowed sister in Boston, had decided to take the risk. A tall figure detached itself from the shadow of the general store across the street, and Margaret felt her breath catch, though that might have been the precursor to another cough. The man who walked toward her was lean and broad-shouldered, moving with the confident stride of someone comfortable in his own skin. He wore dusty work clothes, a brown leather vest over a blue cotton shirt, dark trousers tucked into scuffed boots, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. As he drew closer, she could see that he was handsome in a rugged way, with sun-bronzed skin, a strong jaw, and eyes the color of a summer sky. "Miss Nelson?" His voice was deep and warm, with a slight drawl that marked him as a man of the West. "Yes." She tried to smile, but another cough erupted from her chest, this one so fierce that she doubled over, her whole body shaking with the force of it. Clayton Vance closed the distance between them in 3 long strides, his hand coming to rest on her back, steadying her. "Madam, how long have you had that cough?" "A few weeks," she gasped out when she could finally speak. "It is nothing, truly. Just the dust and the travel. I will be fine once I have had some rest." But even as she said the words, she could see the doubt in his eyes. He glanced at the driver, who was unloading her trunk from the back of the coach, then back at her face. Margaret knew what he must be seeing. Dark circles under her eyes, skin too pale, lips chapped and dry. She looked nothing like the photograph she had sent him months ago, when she had been healthy and well. "Let me get your things," Clayton said, his voice gentle. "Then I am taking you to see Doc Harris." "That is not necessary," Margaret protested, even as another cough threatened to break free. "I just need to rest, as you said." "Madam, with all due respect, that cough sounds like it is trying to tear you apart from the inside. I would not be much of a husband if I let you suffer without at least having a doctor take a look." The word husband sent a strange flutter through Margaret's chest. She had agreed to marry this man, had traveled halfway across the country to become his wife, but standing here in the dusty street, she felt like a fraud. She was supposed to be strong and capable, ready to help him build a life on the frontier, but instead, she was weak and sick, barely able to stand without trembling. Clayton paid the driver and hefted her trunk onto his shoulder as if it weighed nothing at all. With his free hand, he gently took her elbow, guiding her down the wooden sidewalk. Margaret wanted to protest, to insist that she could walk on her own, but the truth was that she was grateful for his support. Her legs felt like water, and the constant coughing had left her muscles aching and sore. The doctor's office was a small building sandwiched between a saloon and a dry goods store. Clayton pushed open the door and ushered her inside, calling out, "Doc Harris, you here? Got someone who needs looking at." An older man with silver hair and spectacles emerged from a back room, wiping his hands on a clean cloth. His eyes went immediately to Margaret, taking in her pallor and the way she was breathing in short, shallow gasps. "Bring her back here," he said, gesturing to an examination room. "What seems to be the trouble?" "Got a cough that would not quit," Clayton said, setting Margaret's trunk down in the waiting area. "She just arrived on the stage from back east." "I see. Well, let us have a look." Doc Harris guided Margaret to a chair and listened to her chest with a stethoscope, his brow furrowing as he moved the instrument from place to place. He asked her questions about when the cough had started, whether she had a fever, if she had been around anyone else who was sick. Margaret answered as best she could between coughs, feeling increasingly embarrassed and worried. Finally, Doc Harris stepped back and removed the stethoscope from his ears. "You have got congestion in your lungs, young lady. Not pneumonia yet, thank the Lord, but if you do not take care of yourself, it could easily turn into that. What you need is rest, plenty of fluids, and time to let your body heal. No exertion, no stress, just rest." "But I just arrived," Margaret said, dismayed. "Mr. Vance and I are supposed to be married. I cannot just lie about doing nothing." "If you do not rest, you might end up doing nothing permanently," Doc Harris said bluntly. "I have seen too many people ignore these kinds of symptoms, and I have buried more than a few of them. You listen to me, and you listen good. You need at least 2 weeks of complete rest, maybe more depending on how you respond. That means staying in bed, keeping warm, drinking plenty of liquids, and not lifting so much as a finger to help with anything." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. This was not how things were supposed to go. She was supposed to arrive healthy and capable, ready to become Clayton's wife and partner. Instead, she was a burden before they had even exchanged vows. "Doc is right," Clayton said from the doorway, where he had been listening. His voice was firm but kind. "Miss Nelson, you are going to rest, and you are going to get better. Everything else can wait." "But the wedding?" Margaret said weakly. "And I am supposed to help you with the ranch." "That was the agreement. The agreement was that you would come out here and we would build a life together," Clayton said, moving into the room. "Cannot very well do that if you are too sick to stand, can we? First things first. You get better, then we will worry about the rest." Doc Harris nodded approvingly. "Smart man. Now, I am going to give you some medicine to help with the cough and ease the congestion. You take a spoonful 3 times a day and make sure she drinks plenty of water, Vance. Warm broth would be good too. Keep her warm and dry, and let her sleep as much as she needs." "I have a room at the hotel," Margaret said, though the thought of climbing stairs to a hotel room filled her with dread. "No, you do not," Clayton said decisively. "You are coming out to the ranch with me. I have a housekeeper, Mrs. Dawson, who can look after you properly. The hotel is noisy and dusty, not the place for someone who needs to heal." "But that would not be proper," Margaret protested. "We are not married yet, and for me to stay in your home without a chaperone—" "Mrs. Dawson is all the chaperone you need," Clayton interrupted. "She is a widow, respectable as they come, and she will not let there be any impropriety. Besides, what is not proper is letting you stay in a hotel room by yourself when you are sick enough to need care." Margaret wanted to argue further, but another coughing fit seized her, this one so severe that she saw black spots dancing at the edges of her vision. When it finally subsided, she found herself leaning against Clayton's solid chest, his arms supporting her weight. He smelled of leather and horses and something indefinably masculine, and despite her illness, she felt a strange sense of safety in his embrace. "It is settled then," Clayton said, his voice rumbling in his chest beneath her ear. You're coming home with me, and you're going to rest until that cough is gone. Doc Harris handed Clayton a dark bottle of medicine and repeated his instructions. Clayton paid the doctor and then scooped Margaret up into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. She gasped in surprise, instinctively wrapping her arms around his neck. "Mr. Vance, I can walk," she protested, though her voice lacked conviction. "Clayton," he corrected gently. "And I know you can walk, but why should you when I can carry you just fine? Save your strength for getting better." He carried her out to a wagon that was hitched in front of the doctor's office, settling her carefully on the bench seat. He retrieved her trunk and loaded it into the back, then climbed up beside her. Before he snapped the reins, he removed his jacket and draped it over her shoulders, tucking it around her with surprising gentleness. "Sun is getting low," he said. "Gets cold quick out here once it sets. This will help keep you warm." The jacket was warm from his body heat and much too large for her, but Margaret pulled it closer gratefully. Now that the adrenaline of arrival was fading, she could feel the chill in the air, and she shivered despite herself. The ride to the ranch took about 30 minutes, following a rutted dirt road that led away from town and into the open prairie. Margaret had never seen so much sky before, vast and endless, painted in shades of orange and pink as the sun sank toward the horizon. The land rolled in gentle swells, covered in brown grass that rustled in the wind, and in the distance she could see small clusters of cattle grazing peacefully. Clayton did not press her to talk, seeming content to let her rest against his shoulder as he drove. Margaret was grateful for that. Her throat was raw from coughing, and she was so tired that she could barely keep her eyes open. She found herself drifting, lulled by the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels and the warmth of Clayton's body beside her. She roused when the wagon came to a stop in front of a sturdy house built of wood and stone. It was not large, but it looked well made and cared for, with a covered porch that wrapped around two sides and windows that gleamed in the fading light. A barn stood nearby, along with several other outbuildings, and she could see a corral where horses moved restlessly in the twilight. The front door opened and a woman emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 50 years old, with gray streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun and a face that was both stern and kind at the same time. "About time you got back, Clayton," she called out. "I was beginning to think you might have missed the stage." Then her eyes fell on Margaret, and her expression shifted to one of concern. "Lord have mercy, what has happened? That girl looks like death warmed over." "Bad cough," Clayton said, climbing down from the wagon and then reaching up to lift Margaret down. "Doc Harris says she needs rest and care, or it could turn into pneumonia. Can you fix up the guest room for her, Mrs. Dawson?" Of course, of course. Bring her right inside. I will have the room ready in 2 shakes." Mrs. Dawson bustled back into the house, already calling out instructions to someone inside. Clayton carried Margaret up the porch steps and through the front door into a comfortable main room. There was a large stone fireplace on one wall, several sturdy chairs and a sofa arranged around it, and braided rugs on the wooden floor. Everything was clean and neat, with touches that spoke of a woman's care: curtains on the windows, a vase of dried flowers on the mantel, cushions on the chairs. Mrs. Dawson appeared in a doorway to the left, beckoning. "In here, bring her in here. I have turned down the bed and opened the window to air it out." The guest room was small but cozy, with a brass bed covered in a colorful quilt, a dresser with a wash basin and pitcher, and a rocking chair in the corner. Clayton set Margaret on the edge of the bed with the same gentleness he had shown all afternoon. "I will get your trunk," he said, then looked at Mrs. Dawson. "She needs medicine 3 times a day. And Doc said plenty of fluids and warm broth. He said she needs to rest completely, no exertion at all." "I heard you the first time," Mrs. Dawson said tartly, but her eyes were soft as she looked at Margaret. "Do not you worry, child. I will take good care of you. Now you men get out of here so I can help this young lady into her night clothes and get her settled properly." Clayton nodded and left the room, closing the door behind him. Mrs. Dawson turned to Margaret with a kind smile. Let us get you out of that traveling dress and into something comfortable, shall we? You must be exhausted, poor thing. Margaret wanted to insist that she could manage on her own, but the truth was that her fingers were trembling too much to work the buttons on her dress. Mrs. Dawson helped her with practiced efficiency, chatting in a soothing voice about the ranch and the weather, and nothing in particular. Soon Margaret was dressed in her white cotton nightgown, her hair brushed and braided, and tucked into the soft bed with several quilts piled on top of her. There now, Mrs. Dawson said, adjusting the pillows. You sleep as long as you like. I will bring you some broth and tea in a little while, and your medicine. If you need anything at all during the night, you just call out. I am right next door, and I am a light sleeper. Thank you, Margaret whispered, her eyes already closing. You are very kind. Nonsense, it is only Christian charity. Now you rest. Margaret heard the soft click of the door closing, and then she surrendered to the exhaustion that had been pulling at her all day. She slept deeply, waking only when Mrs. Dawson gently shook her shoulder and helped her sit up to drink some broth and take a spoonful of the medicine Doc Harris had provided. The medicine tasted bitter, but it did seem to ease the tickle in her throat. She managed to eat a few spoonfuls of broth before sleep claimed her again. The next few days passed in a haze of sleeping and waking. Margaret would surface long enough to take her medicine, eat a little something, and use the chamber pot with Mrs. Dawson's discreet assistance. Then she would sink back into sleep like a stone dropping into water. The coughing continued, harsh and violent, leaving her gasping and weak, but slowly, gradually, it seemed to ease a little. The medicine helped, as did the rest, and she could feel her body starting to respond to the care she was receiving. On the fourth morning, Margaret woke feeling more alert than she had since her arrival. The cough was still there, but it was not as constant, and her throat did not feel quite as raw. Sunlight was streaming through the window, making patterns on the quilt, and she could hear birds singing outside. She sat up carefully, expecting the dizziness that had plagued her, but while her head felt heavy, it did not spin. There was a soft knock on the door, and Mrs. Dawson entered carrying a tray. Well, look at you sitting up on your own. That is a good sign. How are you feeling this morning? Better, Margaret said, and was pleased to find that her voice, while still hoarse, was stronger than it had been. Still tired, but better. Good, good. I brought you some oatmeal with honey and some tea. Think you can manage more than broth today? I would like to try. Mrs. Dawson set the tray on Margaret's lap and settled into the rocking chair, clearly prepared to stay and make sure she ate. You had us worried there for a bit, you know. That first night, you were coughing so hard I thought you might crack a rib. Clayton was up half the night, pacing in the main room like a caged animal. Margaret felt her cheeks warm. I am sorry to have caused so much trouble. Trouble? Nonsense. What is trouble is traveling halfway across the country when you are sick as a dog. What is trouble is not taking care of yourself properly. But you are young, and the young always think they are invincible. Mrs. Dawson rocked gently, her hands folded in her lap. That Clayton is a good man, you know. He was out here all alone for 2 years after his folks passed, trying to run this place by himself. When he told me he was looking for a wife, I thought it was about time. A man needs a partner, especially out here. What happened to his parents? Margaret asked, spooning up some oatmeal. It was warm and sweet, and her stomach growled in appreciation. Fever took them both, winter of '74. That was a hard winter, hard on everyone. Clayton was only 28 then, but he had been working the ranch with his father since he was a boy, so he knew what to do. Still, it is a lot for one person. He hired some hands to help with the cattle, and he asked me to come keep house for him. My husband had passed the year before, and I was looking for work, so it suited us both. Margaret ate slowly, savoring each bite. It was the first solid food she had had in days, and her body seemed to wake up in response, reminding her of how hungry she actually was. He seems very kind. Kind, yes, but also stubborn as a mule when he sets his mind to something. Once he decided you were going to rest until you were well, there was no moving him on it. Told me to make sure you did not lift a finger, and I have had my orders." Mrs. Dawson smiled. "He has been asking after you every morning and every evening, wanting to know how you are doing. I think he would come in and check on you himself, but he does not want to breach propriety." Margaret felt something warm bloom in her chest at the thought of Clayton worrying about her. They barely knew each other, and yet he had taken responsibility for her care without hesitation. It spoke well of his character, she thought, and made her hopeful that perhaps this marriage would not be a disaster after all. Over the next week, Margaret grew steadily stronger. The cough persisted, but became less frequent and less violent. She was able to stay awake for longer periods, and Mrs. Dawson began bringing meals that she ate sitting in the rocking chair by the window, looking out at the vast prairie that stretched to the horizon. She saw Clayton occasionally, riding out to check on the cattle or working in the corral with the horses, and sometimes he would look up and see her in the window. He would raise his hand in a wave, and she would wave back, feeling a little thrill each time their eyes met across the distance. On the 10th day, Doc Harris came to check on her. He listened to her chest again, asked her questions, and finally nodded in satisfaction. "Lungs are clearing up nicely. Cough should be gone in another week or so, I would wager. You are a lucky young woman, Miss Nelson. If you had kept pushing yourself instead of resting, this could have gone very differently." "I have Mr. Vance to thank for that," Margaret said. "He insisted I rest, even though I protested." "Smart man," Doc Harris said, echoing what he had said at their first meeting. "You listen to him, and you will do just fine out here." After the doctor left, Mrs. Dawson helped Margaret dress in a simple day dress and brush out her hair. "Think you are up to sitting in the main room for a bit? Change of scenery might do you good, and Clayton has been wanting to see how you are doing." Margaret's heart fluttered nervously. "Do I look presentable?" "You look much better than you did 10 days ago, I can tell you that. Got some color back in your cheeks. Come on now, no need to be nervous. He does not bite." Margaret followed Mrs. Dawson out of the bedroom and into the main room. Clayton was standing by the fireplace, but he turned when he heard them approach. His face lit up with a smile that transformed his rugged features, making him look younger and impossibly handsome. "Miss Nelson," he said, coming forward, "it is good to see you up and about. How are you feeling?" "Much better, thank you. And please call me Margaret. I think we are beyond formalities, given the circumstances." "Margaret," he repeated, as if testing the name on his tongue. "I am glad to hear you are improving. You had us all worried for a while there." "I am sorry to have been such a burden," Margaret said, feeling the need to apologize again. "You have not been a burden," Clayton said firmly. "You were sick, and you needed help. That is what people do for each other out here. They help. We might not have the fancy hospitals and doctors you have back east, but we take care of our own." Mrs. Dawson bustled past them. "I will leave you two to talk. Mind you do not tire her out, Clayton. She is still recovering." "Yes, madam," Clayton said with a hint of amusement in his voice. When Mrs. Dawson had disappeared into the kitchen, he gestured to the sofa. "Would you like to sit? I promise I will not keep you long if you are tired." Margaret settled onto the sofa, and Clayton took one of the chairs across from her. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, and Margaret felt that flutter in her chest again. He was even more handsome up close, with laugh lines at the corners of his eyes and a small scar on his chin that she had not noticed before. "I want to apologize," Clayton said after a moment. "I know this is not how you expected things to go when you agreed to come out here. I am sure you thought you would arrive, we would get married, and you would start your new life. Instead, you have been sick and bedridden, and we have not even had a chance to really get to know each other." "You have nothing to apologize for," Margaret said quickly. "If anyone should apologize, it is me. I should have taken better care of myself during the journey. I felt the cough coming on, but I thought I could push through it. I was foolish." "You were determined." Clayton corrected. There is a difference, but I am glad you are feeling better now. Doc Harris says you should be fully recovered in another week or so. That is what he said. I hope he is right. I am eager to start being useful instead of lying about like an invalid. Clayton leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Margaret, I want you to know something. When I wrote to you, when I asked you to come out here and be my wife, it was not because I needed a workhorse. I can hire hands to help with the ranch work. What I wanted was a partner, someone to share my life with, someone to talk to at the end of the day, to make plans with, to build something with. I know we are practically strangers, and I know this has been a rough start, but I hope you will give us a chance to get to know each other properly before we make any decisions about the future. Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. I would like that very much. I confess I was worried that you would be disappointed in me, that I would not be what you expected. You are exactly what I expected, Clayton said softly. Someone brave enough to leave everything she knows behind and start a new life in a place she has never been. That takes courage, Margaret. That takes heart. The cough does not change any of that. They talked for another hour, and Margaret felt herself relaxing in his presence. Clayton was easy to talk to, with a dry sense of humor that made her laugh and a genuine interest in her thoughts and opinions. He told her about the ranch, about the challenges of running a cattle operation in Kansas, about the neighbors in the town. She told him about her life in Boston, about her family, about the books she loved to read, and the dreams she had for the future. Finally, Mrs. Dawson appeared and announced that it was time for Margaret to rest again. Clayton stood immediately, offering his hand to help her up from the sofa. His hand was warm and calloused, the hand of a man who worked hard for his living, and Margaret liked the strength she felt in his grip. Thank you for the conversation, she said. I enjoyed it very much. So did I. Rest well, Margaret. I will see you tomorrow. As Margaret settled back into her bed, she found herself smiling. Perhaps this would work out after all. Perhaps Clayton Vance would be more than just a husband in name. Perhaps they could truly build the life together that they had both written about in their letters. The next week passed in a pleasant routine. Each morning, Margaret would wake feeling a little stronger, a little more like herself. The cough was fading, becoming occasional rather than constant, and her appetite had returned with a vengeance. Mrs. Dawson seemed delighted to feed her, bringing generous portions of hearty food that Margaret devoured gratefully. Clayton would join them for meals, and afterward, he and Margaret would sit together in the main room, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about his childhood growing up on the ranch, about learning to ride and rope from his father, about the harsh winters and the beautiful springs when the prairie came alive with wildflowers. She told him about her father, who had been a school teacher, and how he had instilled in her a love of learning that had sometimes made her feel out of place in Boston society, where women were not expected to have opinions about politics or philosophy. You would not have that problem out here, Clayton said with a grin. Out here, we need women who can think for themselves. Life is too hard to have a partner who cannot make decisions when decisions need to be made. Margaret found herself looking forward to these conversations more than she had looked forward to anything in a long time. Clayton was intelligent and thoughtful, and he treated her as an equal in a way that the men in Boston never had. He asked her opinion on things, listened when she spoke, and seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say. More than once, she found herself thinking that she might be falling in love with him, truly in love, not just grateful for his kindness. On the 18th day after her arrival, Margaret woke without coughing. She lay in bed for a moment, waiting for the familiar tickle in her throat, the urge to cough that had been her constant companion for more than a month, but it did not come. She took a deep breath, then another. Feeling her lungs expand fully without any congestion or tightness, she was healed. Margaret dressed quickly in one of her better day dresses, a blue calico that brought out the color of her eyes. She brushed her hair until it shone and pinned it up in a style that was both practical and pretty. When she looked at herself in the small mirror over the dresser, She saw a different woman than the one who had arrived 3 weeks ago. There was color in her cheeks, brightness in her eyes, and a sense of vitality that had been missing for so long. She found Clayton and Mrs. Dawson in the kitchen, sitting at the table with coffee and discussing plans for the day. They both looked up when she entered, and Clayton's face broke into a wide smile. "Margaret, you look wonderful. How are you feeling?" "I am well," she said, unable to keep the joy out of her voice. "Truly well. The cough is gone, and I feel like myself again for the first time in weeks." Mrs. Dawson clapped her hands together. "Praise be, I knew you would pull through, child. You are too stubborn to let a little cough get the better of you." Clayton stood, pulling out a chair for Margaret. "Sit, please. Have some breakfast. This calls for a celebration." "I do not need to sit," Margaret said, laughing. "I have been sitting for 3 weeks. What I need is to do something useful." "Mrs. Dawson, please let me help with the chores. I am going mad with idleness." "Absolutely not," Mrs. Dawson said firmly. "You just got better. No sense in pushing yourself too hard and having a relapse." "I am not going to have a relapse from washing some dishes or sweeping the floor," Margaret protested. "Please, I need to feel useful again." Clayton and Mrs. Dawson exchanged a glance, and then Clayton sighed. "Tell you what, you can help Mrs. Dawson with light chores around the house, but only for a few hours, and the moment you start feeling tired, you rest." "Agreed?" "Agreed," Margaret said quickly, before he could change his mind. It felt wonderful to be useful again. Margaret helped Mrs. Dawson prepare lunch, kneading dough for bread and chopping vegetables for stew. Her hands remembered the motions from years of helping her mother in the kitchen, and there was something deeply satisfying about creating something tangible after weeks of doing nothing. Mrs. Dawson watched her like a hawk, ready to pounce if she showed any sign of exhaustion, but Margaret felt energized rather than tired. After lunch, Clayton asked if she would like to take a walk with him around the property. "Just a short one," he said. "I know you have been cooped up inside, and I thought you might like to see the ranch properly." Margaret accepted eagerly. She put on her shawl against the cool November air and took Clayton's offered arm. They walked slowly down the path from the house toward the barn, and Margaret breathed deeply, savoring the fresh air and the wide open sky. "It is so beautiful here," she said, looking out at the rolling prairie. "So different from Boston. Everything there is so crowded, so close together. Here you can see for miles." "Does it feel lonely?" Clayton asked, watching her face carefully. "No," Margaret said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "It feels like freedom." Clayton smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and made her heart skip a beat. "I am glad you think so. I was worried you might find it too isolated, too quiet after city life." "I thought I might," Margaret admitted. "But I have realized over these past few weeks that I was never truly happy in Boston. I always felt like I was trying to fit into a mold that was not made for me. Here, I feel like I can breathe." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, and Clayton pointed out various landmarks: the creek where the cattle went to drink, the far pasture where the spring calves would graze, the cottonwood tree where he had built a treehouse as a boy. Margaret listened, storing away each detail, building a picture in her mind of what her life here might be like. When they reached the corral, a beautiful chestnut mare trotted over to greet them. Clayton pulled a carrot from his pocket and offered it to the horse, who took it delicately from his palm. "This is Rosie," he said, stroking the mare's nose. "She is gentle as a lamb. Once you are fully recovered, I can teach you to ride, if you would like." "I would like that very much," Margaret said, reaching out tentatively to touch the mare's neck. The horse's coat was warm and soft under her fingers, and Rosie turned her head to nuzzle Margaret's shoulder, making her laugh. "She likes you," Clayton said, sounding pleased. "Horses are good judges of character." They stood there for a moment, side by side, watching the horses move in the corral. Then Clayton cleared his throat, and when Margaret looked at him, she saw that he looked nervous. "Margaret, there is something I need to ask you. You have been here for 3 weeks now, And while I know that most of that time you were sick, I hope you have gotten some sense of what life here would be like. I know we said we would get to know each other before making any decisions, but I find that I do not want to wait any longer. These past few weeks getting to know you, seeing your strength and your spirit, even when you were sick, I have come to care for you deeply. I would be honored if you would still agree to be my wife. Margaret's heart was pounding in her chest, but it was not from fear or uncertainty. It was from joy, pure and simple. Yes, she said, the word coming out in a rush. Yes, Clayton, I will marry you. I would be honored to be your wife. The smile that broke across Clayton's face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. He took both of her hands in his, holding them gently. You have made me very happy, Margaret Nelson. When would you like to have the ceremony? As soon as it can be arranged, Margaret said, feeling bold. I did not come all this way to wait any longer than necessary. Clayton laughed, a sound of pure delight. Tomorrow, then. I will ride into town this afternoon and speak to Reverend Matthews. We can have the ceremony here at the ranch, if that suits you, with Mrs. Dawson and a few neighbors as witnesses. That sounds perfect. Clayton raised one of her hands to his lips and kissed it gently, his eyes never leaving hers. Margaret felt a shiver run through her that had nothing to do with the cold November air and everything to do with the promise in his gaze. That evening, the house was full of activity. Mrs. Dawson took charge of preparing for the wedding, making lists and giving orders with military precision. A simple ceremony required simple preparations, she declared, but that did not mean it should not be done properly. She and Margaret went through Margaret's trunk, choosing the best dress for the occasion, a deep green velvet that had been her Sunday best in Boston. You will look lovely in this, Mrs. Dawson said, holding the dress up to the light. I will press it tonight so it is fresh for tomorrow, and I will bake a cake, and we will have a proper wedding supper afterward. You do not have to go to so much trouble, Margaret said, though she was touched by the older woman's enthusiasm. Nonsense. A wedding is important, even a simple one. You only do this once if you are lucky, so it should be done right. Mrs. Dawson set the dress aside and took Margaret's hands in hers. I am happy for you, child. Clayton is a good man, and I think you two will suit each other very well. He needs someone with spirit, someone who will not just follow along, but will stand beside him. I think you are that person. I hope so, Margaret said softly. I want to make him happy. You already do. I see it in the way he looks at you, the way his whole face lights up when you walk into a room. That boy is in love with you, whether he has said the words yet or not. Margaret felt her cheeks warm. I am in love with him too. I did not expect it to happen so quickly, but it has. Is that foolish? Not foolish at all. Sometimes you just know, deep in your bones, that a person is right for you. My husband and I, we knew after 3 days of courting, we were married a month later and had 40 happy years together before the Lord called him home. When you know, you know. That night, Margaret lay in bed unable to sleep, not from coughing, but from excitement. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Clayton Vance. Tomorrow she would begin her new life in earnest. She thought about all the things that had led her to this moment. Her decision to respond to Clayton's advertisement, the long journey west, the illness that had nearly derailed everything. Looking back, she could see the hand of Providence in it all. If she had not been sick, if Clayton had not insisted she rest, they would not have had those 3 weeks to talk and get to know each other. They might have married immediately, two strangers bound by law, but not by affection. Instead, they were marrying as friends, as partners, with the foundation of genuine care and respect already laid. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of perfect November day that seemed designed for new beginnings. Margaret woke early and found that Mrs. Dawson had already drawn a bath for her in the kitchen, heating water on the stove and filling the large copper tub. Margaret bathed luxuriously, washing her hair with the lavender soap Mrs. Dawson provided, feeling like a bride preparing for her wedding day, because that was exactly what she was. Mrs. Dawson helped her dress, lacing the green velvet gown and arranging her hair in an elegant style, with curls framing her face, and the rest pinned up with small white flowers that the housekeeper had somehow managed to find despite the season. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Dawson said, her eyes suspiciously bright. "Clayton is not going to know what hit him." The neighbors began arriving around noon. The Petersons, who owned the ranch to the east, and the McCormick family, who ran the general store in town. Reverend Matthews arrived with his wife, a plump, cheerful woman who exclaimed over everything and pronounced it all delightful. They gathered in the main room, which Mrs. Dawson had decorated with pine boughs and candles, and then Clayton was there, standing by the fireplace, and Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. He was wearing a black suit that she had never seen before, his dark hair neatly combed, his blue eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her knees weak. He looked handsome and strong, and suddenly shy, as if he too was feeling the enormity of what they were about to do. Reverend Matthews took his place in front of the fireplace and gestured for Margaret and Clayton to join him. Margaret walked forward, her heart pounding, and took her place beside Clayton. He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers, and she held on tight. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. Reverend Matthews spoke about the sacredness of marriage, about partnership and commitment, about building a life together through good times and bad. When it came time for the vows, Clayton's voice was steady and sure as he promised to love and cherish Margaret, to stand by her side, to be her partner in all things. Margaret's voice shook slightly when she made her own promises, but the words came from her heart, and she meant every one of them. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Matthews said with a broad smile. "Clayton, you may kiss your bride." Clayton turned to Margaret, his hands coming up to cup her face gently. "Hello, wife," he murmured, and then he kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise. The small gathering burst into applause, and when they broke apart, Margaret was blushing and smiling so hard her cheeks hurt. The wedding supper was a cheerful affair, with Mrs. Dawson's excellent cooking and plenty of laughter. The neighbors shared stories about Clayton as a boy, embarrassing tales that made him groan, and Margaret laugh until tears ran down her cheeks. Mrs. McCormick insisted on cutting the cake, a beautiful white cake with sugar icing, and everyone toasted the new couple with apple cider. As the sun began to set, the neighbors took their leave, offering congratulations and invitations to visit. Reverend Matthews and his wife departed, and Mrs. Dawson announced that she would be spending the night at her sister's house in town, giving the newlyweds privacy. "Now you behave yourself, Clayton Vance," she said, wagging her finger at him with mock sternness. "And you take good care of that wife of yours." "Yes, madam," Clayton said, grinning. "I will do my best." And then they were alone, standing in the main room as the fire crackled in the hearth and the last light faded from the windows. Margaret felt suddenly nervous, unsure of what to say or do. They were married now, husband and wife, but this was still so new, so unfamiliar. Clayton seemed to sense her nervousness. He took her hand and led her to the sofa, sitting down and pulling her down beside him. "You do not need to be nervous," he said gently. "We do not have to do anything you are not ready for. We have all the time in the world." "I am not nervous about that," Margaret said, surprising herself with her honesty. "I trust you, Clayton. I am just overwhelmed, I think. A month ago, I was in Boston, coughing my way across the country, not sure what I was getting myself into. And now I am here, married to you, and I am happy. It is almost too much happiness to hold all at once." Clayton smiled and pulled her closer, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "I know what you mean. I feel the same way. But Margaret, I want you to know something. I meant every word of those vows today. I am going to spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy, trying to be the husband you deserve. You took a risk coming out here, and I am going to make sure you never regret it." Margaret turned to look at him, This man who had shown her such kindness, such care, from the moment she had stepped off that stagecoach. "I do not regret it," she said firmly. "Not for a moment. You insisted I rest when I wanted to push through. You took care of me when I was too stubborn to take care of myself. You gave me time to heal, time to get to know you. You have already proven yourself to be a good man, Clayton Vance, and I am proud to be your wife." He kissed her then, deeper than before, and Margaret felt heat bloom in her belly. She wrapped her arms around his neck, kissing him back with all the love and desire she felt. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard, and Clayton's eyes had darkened with want. "Come with me," he said, standing and offering his hand. Margaret took it and he led her to his bedroom, a room she had not been in before. It was simple and masculine, with a large bed covered in a patchwork quilt, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the prairie. Clayton lit a lamp on the bedside table, then turned to her. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice husky. "I meant what I said. We can wait if you want to." "I do not want to wait," Margaret said, reaching up to touch his face. "I want to be your wife in every way. I want this, Clayton. I want you." He kissed her again, his hands moving to the buttons of her dress, undoing them slowly, reverently. Margaret helped him, her own hands working at the buttons of his shirt, eager to feel his skin against hers. They undressed each other with a mixture of urgency and tenderness, and when they finally lay together in the big bed, skin to skin, Margaret felt a sense of rightness settle over her like a benediction. Clayton made love to her with patience and care, taking his time, making sure she was comfortable, that she was with him every step of the way. There was some pain, as she had expected, but there was also pleasure, a building warmth that spread through her body and made her gasp his name. Afterward, they lay tangled together, Margaret's head on Clayton's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I love you," Clayton said softly, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her bare shoulder. "I think I have loved you since you got off that stagecoach, coughing so hard I thought you might break in half, but still trying to stand tall and be brave. You have a beautiful spirit, Margaret, and I am the luckiest man alive to call you mine." "I love you too," Margaret whispered, pressing a kiss to his chest. "Thank you for making me rest until the cough quit. Thank you for taking care of me. Thank you for giving me a chance to know you before we married." "I think we were always meant to find each other," Clayton said. "All the letters, the miles between us, your illness, all of it brought us to this moment. I would not change a thing." "Neither would I," Margaret agreed. They fell asleep in each other's arms, and when Margaret woke in the morning, she found Clayton watching her with such tenderness in his eyes that it made her heart ache in the best way possible. The days that followed were full of discovery and joy. Margaret threw herself into learning the rhythms of ranch life, and Clayton was a patient teacher. He taught her to ride, first on gentle Rosie and then on livelier horses, until she could gallop across the prairie with confidence. He taught her to rope, though she was admittedly terrible at it, and they both laughed until they cried at her failed attempts. He showed her the workings of the ranch, explaining how they managed the herd, how they prepared for the harsh Kansas winters, how they planned for the future. Margaret, in turn, made the house a home. She cooked meals that combined her Boston recipes with Mrs. Dawson's frontier wisdom, creating dishes that were both comforting and practical. She sewed curtains for the windows and quilts for the beds. She started a small garden plot, planning what she would plant come spring. She wrote letters to her sister in Boston, telling her about her new life, about Clayton, about how happy she was. Mrs. Dawson returned after giving them a week alone, and the three of them settled into a comfortable routine. The housekeeper had a room in the house, but spent much of her time visiting her sister in town, giving the newlyweds privacy. She seemed delighted by the obvious love between Clayton and Margaret, often humming to herself as she worked and making knowing comments that made them both blush. Winter arrived in earnest in December, bringing snow and bitter cold. Margaret discovered that she loved the winter on the prairie. The way the snow transformed the landscape into something clean and pure, the way the house became a warm haven against the storm. She and Clayton would spend the evenings by the fire, reading aloud to each other from books, or simply talking about their days, their dreams, their plans for the future. One evening in late January, as they sat together on the sofa with a quilt over their laps, Clayton said, "I have been thinking about expanding the herd this spring. The Petersons are selling some of their cattle, good breeding stock, and I think it would be a smart investment. What do you think?" Margaret considered this, thinking about the conversations they had had about the ranch finances and the markets. "Can we afford it? I know cattle prices have been unpredictable." "We can, but it would be tight for a while. We would need to be careful with our spending, make sure we have enough set aside for emergencies." "I think you should do it," Margaret said decisively. "You have been talking about expanding for months now, and the Petersons' cattle are good stock. It is a risk, but it is a calculated one. Besides, we are young and strong. We can handle tight times if we need to." Clayton kissed her temple, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Have I told you today that I love you?" "Yes, but I will never tire of hearing it." "I love you, Margaret Vance. You are the best partner a man could ask for." As winter gave way to spring, Margaret realized that she had not had her monthly courses in some time. At first, she thought it was just the change in her life, the stress of adapting to a new place. But when she began to feel nauseous in the mornings and found herself exhausted by midday, she began to suspect the truth. She waited another week, wanting to be sure before she said anything, and then one evening as they were preparing for bed, she took Clayton's hand and placed it on her still flat belly. "I think we are going to have a baby," she said, watching his face carefully. Clayton's eyes went wide, and then a look of such pure joy crossed his features that Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. "Are you sure? When? How are you feeling? Do we need to get the doctor?" Margaret laughed, though tears were streaming down her face now. "I am fairly sure. I think the baby will come sometime in September. I am feeling fine, just tired and a little nauseous in the mornings. We do not need the doctor yet, but we will need him eventually." Clayton pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "A baby," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "We are going to have a baby. Margaret, you have made me the happiest man in the world." "I am happy too," Margaret said, her face pressed against his chest. "I am so happy I could burst." The pregnancy was not easy, especially in the summer heat, but Margaret refused to be coddled. She continued to help around the house and the ranch, though she let Mrs. Dawson take over the heavier tasks, and she stopped writing in her 4th month. Clayton was protective to the point of being overbearing, constantly worried that she was doing too much, but Margaret stood her ground. She was pregnant, she told him, not made of glass. Doc Harris came to check on her regularly, pronouncing her healthy and the baby strong. "You have got good constitution," he told her approvingly. "Should be a straightforward birth if all continues as it has been." In early September, Margaret woke in the pre-dawn darkness with a cramping pain in her belly. She lay still for a moment, wondering if she had eaten something that disagreed with her, and then the pain came again, stronger this time, and she knew. "Clayton," she said, shaking his shoulder. "Clayton, wake up. The baby is coming." Clayton was awake instantly, sitting bolt upright. "Now? Are you sure? Should I get the doctor?" "What do you need?" "Send someone for the doctor and Mrs. Dawson," Margaret said, breathing through another contraction. "And then I need you to stay calm. I cannot have you panicking on me." Clayton dressed in record time and ran to wake one of the ranch hands, sending him to town for the doctor and Mrs. Dawson. Then he came back to Margaret, helping her out of bed and walking with her as she paced the room, trying to ease the growing contractions. Mrs. Dawson arrived first, taking charge of the situation with her usual efficiency. She shooed Clayton out of the room, despite his protests, and helped Margaret into a clean nightgown. "Men are useless during labor," she said firmly. He will just get in the way. You focus on the work you need to do, and I will take care of everything else. The labor was long and hard, lasting through the entire day and into the evening. Margaret had never known such pain, waves of it that seemed to tear her apart, but Mrs. Dawson coached her through each contraction, telling her when to push and when to breathe. Doc Harris arrived in the afternoon and monitored the progress, pronouncing everything normal if difficult. Finally, as the sun was setting, Margaret gave one final push and felt a sudden release. A moment later, a baby's cry filled the room, strong and healthy, and Mrs. Dawson laughed with delight. "It is a boy," she announced, holding up the squirming, red-faced infant. "A beautiful, healthy boy." Doc Harris cut the cord and cleaned the baby, then wrapped him in a soft blanket and placed him in Margaret's arms. She looked down at her son, at his tiny, perfect face and his dark hair, and felt love so fierce and overwhelming that she could not catch her breath. "He is perfect," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He is absolutely perfect." The door burst open, and Clayton rushed in, ignoring Mrs. Dawson's protests. He fell to his knees beside the bed, looking at his wife and son with wonder written all over his face. "Margaret, are you all right? Is he all right? Can I hold him?" "We are both fine," Margaret said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Come meet your son." She transferred the baby carefully into Clayton's arms, and he held the tiny bundle as if it were made of the most precious, fragile thing in the world. "Hello, little one," he said softly. "I am your papa. I have been waiting to meet you." The baby yawned, showing pink gums, and then settled into his father's arms as if he belonged there. Clayton looked at Margaret with such love and gratitude that she felt her heart might burst. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for him. Thank you for our family. I love you so much, Margaret." "I love you too," Margaret said. "Both of you, more than words can say." They named the baby Cole, after Clayton's father, and he was the center of their world from that moment on. The first months were exhausting, with late-night feedings and constant vigilance, but they were also full of joy. Margaret would sometimes wake in the night to find Clayton standing over the cradle, just watching Cole sleep, a look of absolute wonder on his face. As Cole grew, he proved to be a happy, curious baby, with his father's blue eyes and his mother's smile. The ranch hands doted on him, and Mrs. Dawson spoiled him shamelessly, making him toys and knitting him tiny sweaters. The neighbors would come to visit, bringing gifts and congratulations, and the house was always full of laughter and life. When Cole was 6 months old, Margaret realized she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect, and in August of the following year, she gave birth to a daughter they named Catherine. The little girl was the image of Margaret, with dark hair and hazel eyes, and a stubborn streak that made her parents laugh even as it exhausted them. The years passed in a blur of children and cattle, hard work and deep satisfaction. Cole and Catherine were joined by another son, Connor, 2 years later, and the house rang with the sounds of children playing, of laughter and arguments, and the thousand small dramas of family life. Clayton expanded the herd as he had planned, and the ranch prospered. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, lost cattle to disease, and found new markets for their beef. Through it all, Clayton and Margaret stood side by side, partners in every sense of the word. Margaret sometimes thought back to that day in 1876 when she had stepped off the stagecoach, sick and scared, and not sure what she was getting herself into. She thought about how Clayton had insisted she rest, how he had cared for her when she could not care for herself, how he had given her time to heal and to know him. That decision, that kindness had changed the course of her life. She was grateful every single day for the cough that would not quit, because it had given her the man she loved and the life she had always dreamed of. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Clayton surprised her with a trip to the cottonwood tree where his childhood treehouse had been. He had rebuilt it, he told her, making it stronger and safer, a place where their children could play. They climbed up with Cole, Catherine, and Connor and sat together in the branches, looking out over the prairie that had become Margaret's home. "Do you ever regret it?" Clayton asked, his arm around her shoulders as the children explored the treehouse. "Leaving Boston, coming out here, marrying a cowboy you had never met." "Not for a single moment," Margaret said, leaning into his embrace. "You insisted I rest when I needed to, even when I did not want to. You cared for me before you even really knew me. You gave me everything I never knew I wanted." "You gave me everything too," Clayton said, kissing her temple. "A family, a home, a reason to get up every morning. I love you, Margaret Vance." "I love you too," Margaret said, watching their children laugh and play in the treehouse their father had built with his own hands. "I love our life together. I love our family. I love you for making me rest until that cough quit, because that was when everything changed." Clayton laughed, the sound warm and full of love. "Best decision I ever made." As the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the Vance family sat together in the treehouse, surrounded by love and laughter. Margaret looked at her husband, at her children, at the vast, beautiful land that stretched to the horizon, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The mail-order bride who had arrived sick and scared had become a wife, a mother, a partner in building something lasting and true. The cowboy who had made her rest until her cough quit had become the love of her life, the father of her children, the man who stood beside her through everything. Together, they had built a life of purpose and meaning, filled with hard work and deep joy. And it had all started with a cough that would not quit and a cowboy who cared enough to make her rest until it did. Years continued to unfold in their steady rhythm. The children grew tall and strong, learning the ways of the ranch from their father and the wisdom of patience and perseverance from their mother. Cole, as the eldest, developed a deep love for the cattle business and would ride out with Clayton from the time he could sit a horse properly. Catherine proved to have a gift with animals, able to calm even the most skittish horse with her gentle touch and soft words. Connor, the youngest, was the dreamer of the family, always asking questions about the wider world, about what lay beyond the prairie. Margaret started a small school in their home, teaching not only her own children, but also the children of neighboring ranches. She remembered how her father had valued education, and she wanted to pass that gift on to the next generation. Clayton built a small addition onto the house, a room with windows on 3 sides to let in the light, and Margaret filled it with books that she ordered from back east. The children would gather 3 times a week, learning reading and arithmetic and geography, and Margaret found deep satisfaction in watching their minds expand and grow. Mrs. Dawson continued to be a fixture in their lives, though she had finally retired from daily housework and now spent her time visiting between her sister in town and the ranch. She was grandmother to the Vance children, in all but blood, spoiling them with treats and stories about the old days when their father was young. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Clayton hired more hands as the herd expanded, and he built a larger barn to store hay for the winters. He and Margaret made decisions together about every aspect of the business, and the hands learned quickly that Mrs. Vance knew as much about cattle and markets as her husband did. She kept the books, managed the finances, and could calculate profit margins in her head faster than most men could do it with pencil and paper. When Cole turned 18, Clayton made him a full partner in the ranch, and father and son worked together to continue building what Clayton's father had started decades before. Catherine married a young veterinarian who came through town, a kind man named Daniel who shared her love of animals. They built a house on the far corner of the ranch property, close enough to visit but far enough for privacy, and Catherine continued to help with the horses while also assisting her husband in his practice. Connor, true to his dreaming nature, went east to attend university, studying literature and philosophy. Clayton was disappointed at first, having hoped all his children would stay on the ranch, but Margaret reminded him that each child had to follow their own path. Connor came home every summer, bringing books and new ideas, and the family would sit around the dinner table having lively debates about politics and art and the changing world. Margaret watched her children grow and thrive, and she marveled at how different each of them was, how they had each found their own way in the world. She and Clayton were grandparents now, with Cole and his wife providing them with two grandsons, and Catherine and Daniel expecting their first child. The house that had once seemed so quiet was now filled again with the sounds of children, and Margaret's heart was full. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Clayton took Margaret on a trip to Denver, their first real journey away from the ranch since they had married. They stayed in a fine hotel, ate in restaurants, and attended the theater, things Margaret had not done since her days in Boston. It was wonderful and exciting, but by the end of the week, they were both eager to return home to the ranch, to the wide open prairie, and the life they had built together. As they sat on the train heading back to Kansas, Clayton took Margaret's hand in his. "Do you remember the day we met?" "Of course I do," Margaret said with a smile. "I got off the stagecoach coughing so hard I thought my lungs might come out, and you looked at me with such concern. I was mortified. I was terrified," Clayton admitted. "I thought you might die before we even had a chance to know each other. But you were so stubborn, wanting to push through it, and I knew I had to make you rest whether you wanted to or not." "Best thing you ever did," Margaret said, squeezing his hand. "If you had let me try to work right away, I probably would have ended up with pneumonia. But you made me rest, and in that resting, we had time to really talk, to really know each other before we married. It gave us the foundation for everything that came after." 25 years, Clayton said wonderingly. 3 children, 2 grandchildren, with another on the way. A thriving ranch. A life filled with love and purpose. "I could not have imagined all this that day you stepped off the stagecoach." "Neither could I," Margaret said. "I was so scared, so uncertain about what I was doing. But you showed me kindness and patience, and you gave me room to become the person I was meant to be. You never tried to make me fit into some mold of what a frontier wife should be. You let me be myself." "How could I do anything else?" Clayton asked, his blue eyes soft with love. "You are extraordinary, Margaret. You always have been. From the moment you arrived, sick and exhausted, but still trying to be brave, I knew you were special. These 25 years have only proven it over and over again." They sat in comfortable silence as the train rolled through the landscape, watching the familiar prairie unfold outside the window. Margaret thought about the girl she had been when she left Boston, unsure and searching for something she could not name. She had found it here in this vast open land with this good man beside her. She had found herself, her purpose, her place in the world. When they arrived back at the ranch, they were greeted with a surprise party that their children had organized. The house was decorated with ribbons and flowers, and there was a feast laid out on tables in the yard. Neighbors came from miles around to celebrate with them, and there was music and dancing under the stars. Margaret stood with Clayton's arm around her waist, watching their children and grandchildren dance, watching their friends celebrate, and she felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. "Thank you," she whispered to Clayton, her head resting on his shoulder. "For what?" "For everything. For making me rest when I needed it. For loving me. For building this life with me. For every single day of these 25 years." Clayton turned her in his arms so he could look into her face. "I am the one who should be thanking you. You took a risk on a cowboy you had never met. You left everything you knew to come to a place you had never been. You built a home here, raised our children, helped me build a legacy. You are my partner, my love, my everything. I thank God every day that you got on that stagecoach, even if it did make you sick." Margaret laughed, rising on her toes to kiss him. "I thank God for it, too. And I thank him for sending me a cowboy who was wise enough to make me rest until my cough quit." They kissed under the stars, while their children and grandchildren danced around them, and Margaret knew that this was what happiness looked like. Not the absence of struggle or hardship, but the presence of love and partnership and shared purpose. She and Clayton had faced challenges together, weathered storms, both literal and figurative, and they had come through it all with their love stronger than ever. The years continued to pass, bringing change and growth. Connor returned from university and surprised everyone by deciding to stay on the ranch after all, though he spent his time writing articles about ranch life and the changing West that were published in newspapers and magazines back east. He married a school teacher from town, a bright woman named Eleanor, who shared his love of books and ideas, and they built a house near Catherine. And Daniel, Cole took over more and more of the daily operations of the ranch as Clayton grew older, and he proved to be an excellent cattleman with a good head for business. The ranch continued to prosper under his management, expanding to include sheep as well as cattle, diversifying in ways that protected them from market fluctuations. Margaret's school grew as well, and eventually the community built a proper schoolhouse in town. Margaret continued to teach, passing on not just academic knowledge, but also the values of hard work, kindness, and perseverance that she and Clayton had tried to live by. When Clayton turned 60, the family gathered for a celebration that lasted 3 days. All three children were there with their families, now including 5 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren. The house was bursting at the seams with people and love and laughter. At one point, Clayton stood to make a toast, and the crowd fell silent. "I am not much for speeches," he began, his voice still strong despite his years, "but I want to say something to the woman who has been by my side for 34 years now. Margaret, when you stepped off that stagecoach with a cough that would not quit, I knew I had to take care of you. What I did not know was that you would spend the next 3 decades taking care of me right back. You have been my partner, my best friend, the love of my life. You have given me children and grandchildren, a home full of warmth and love, and a life richer than I ever dreamed possible. So this birthday toast is really for you, because everything good in my life comes from having you in it." There was not a dry eye in the house as Clayton raised his glass, and Margaret felt tears streaming down her own face as she stood to embrace her husband. The crowd cheered and applauded, and the celebration continued long into the night. But Margaret noticed that Clayton tired more easily now, that he moved a little slower, that he sometimes forgot small things. She said nothing, not wanting to embarrass him, but she watched him carefully and made sure he did not push himself too hard. Cole had taken over the heavy work of the ranch, but Clayton still insisted on riding out to check on the cattle, still made the major decisions, still got up before dawn every day. One spring morning, when Margaret was 60 and Clayton was 62, she woke to find him standing at the window of their bedroom, looking out at the prairie he loved so much. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. "Could not sleep?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. "Just thinking," Clayton said, slipping his arm around her waist. "Thinking about how lucky I am. Thinking about how beautiful this land is. Thinking about how much I love my life." "Me too," Margaret said, leaning into him. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the day begin. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had been different?" Clayton asked after a while. "If you had not gotten sick, if we had just gotten married right away without taking time to know each other?" "Sometimes," Margaret admitted. "But I think we would have found our way to each other regardless. Maybe it would have taken longer, maybe it would have been harder, but I think we were meant to be together." "I think so too," Clayton said. "But I am still glad things happened the way they did. That time when you were recovering, when we sat and talked for hours every day, that set the pattern for our whole marriage. We have always talked to each other, really talked. We have always been honest with each other. We have always worked together as partners. I think that started because you had to rest and I had to be patient." Margaret turned in his arms, looking up at his dear face, lined now with age, but still handsome to her. "You have always been patient with me, even when I was stubborn, even when I wanted to do everything myself. You let me find my way while still being there to catch me if I fell." That is what partners do, Clayton said simply. They give each other room to grow while still standing together. They kissed as the sun rose over the prairie, two people who had built a life together through patience and love and hard work. They had started as strangers brought together by letters and hope, and they had become partners in every sense of the word, bound together by bonds stronger than any formal vow. The morning after that conversation, Clayton went out to ride the fence line with Cole, checking for damage after the spring storms. He did not come back for lunch, which was unusual, and Margaret felt a flutter of worry in her chest. She was standing on the porch, shading her eyes to look for him, when she saw Cole riding back fast, leading Clayton's horse behind him. Margaret's heart seemed to stop. She ran down the steps, meeting Cole as he dismounted. "What happened? Where is your father?" "He is all right, Ma," Cole said quickly, seeing the panic in her eyes. "But he had some kind of spell. Got dizzy and had to sit down. He is resting under the big oak tree by the north pasture. I came back to get the wagon so we can bring him home without him having to ride." Margaret rode back out with Cole in the wagon, her hands clenched tight in her lap. When they reached the oak tree, she found Clayton sitting with his back against the trunk, looking pale and tired. He managed a weak smile when he saw her. "Sorry to scare you," he said as she knelt beside him. "Just got a little dizzy, that is all. I am fine now." But he was not fine. Doc Harris came out to the ranch that afternoon and examined Clayton thoroughly. Afterward, he pulled Margaret and Cole aside, his expression grave. "His heart is wearing out," the doctor said bluntly. "It happens with age. Nothing that can be done about it. He needs to take it easy. No more hard riding, no strenuous work." And even then, he trailed off. But Margaret understood what he was not saying. She thanked the doctor and then went to Clayton, who was resting in their bed. She sat beside him, taking his hand in hers. "Doc says you need to rest," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Really rest this time, not the kind of rest where you sneak out to work when you think no one is looking." Clayton squeezed her hand. "I know. I felt it today, Margaret. Felt my body telling me to slow down. I guess I am not the young man I used to be." "None of us are," Margaret said, blinking back tears. "But that does not mean we love each other any less. We will figure this out together, just like we have figured out everything else." Clayton lived for 5 more years, years that were bittersweet for Margaret. He was no longer able to work the ranch, but he could still sit on the porch and watch his grandchildren play, could still share meals with his family, could still hold Margaret in his arms at night and tell her he loved her. They had long conversations about their life together, about all the things they had done and seen, about the family they had built. He was there when their 4th grandchild was born, when Connor published his first book, when Cole expanded the ranch to include a new breeding program. He was there for family dinners and celebrations, for quiet evenings by the fire, for all the small moments that make up a life. But Margaret could see him growing weaker, could see the life slowly fading from his eyes, even as the love remained constant. On a beautiful autumn day, when the prairie grass was golden and the sky was impossibly blue, Clayton asked Margaret to help him out to the porch. They sat together in the rocking chairs they had shared for so many years, holding hands and watching the sunset. "It has been a good life," Clayton said softly. "Better than I ever dreamed it could be. Thank you for sharing it with me, Margaret." "Thank you for insisting I rest until that cough quit," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "Thank you for every day of the last 40 years. Thank you for loving me." "Always," Clayton whispered. "I will always love you, even after I am gone. You know that, right?" "I know," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "And I will always love you." Clayton died that night, peacefully in his sleep, with Margaret beside him. The family gathered from all corners, and they buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch he had loved so much, under a sky as vast and blue as his eyes had been. Margaret grieved deeply, but she also carried on, because that was what Clayton would have wanted. She continued to live on the ranch, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, teaching at the school, tending her garden, living the life they had built together. She told stories about Clayton to anyone who would listen, keeping his memory alive through her words. On what would have been their 50th wedding anniversary, Margaret stood at Clayton's grave with all three of her children, their spouses, her grandchildren, and now several great grandchildren gathered around her. She told them the story of how she had arrived in Lyndon, Kansas, in the autumn of 1876, coughing so hard she thought she might die, and how a cowboy named Clayton Vance had insisted she rest until the cough quit. That decision, that kindness changed everything, she told them, her voice strong despite her 80 years. It gave us time to really know each other before we married. It set the pattern for our whole life together. Your grandfather taught me that sometimes the greatest act of love is making someone rest when they do not want to, is taking care of them even when they insist they are fine. He showed me patience and kindness from the very first day, and he never stopped showing me those things for 40 years. She looked around at the faces of her descendants, at the legacy she and Clayton had built together. I want you all to remember this. Love is not just romance and passion, though we had plenty of both. Love is also patience and partnership. It is working together through the hard times. It is insisting someone rest when they need to, even if they protest. It is building something together that will last long after you are gone. She placed a hand on the headstone, tracing Clayton's name with her fingers. I was a mail-order bride with a cough that would not quit. He was a cowboy who made me rest until it did. And from that simple beginning, we built a life, a family, a legacy of love that continues in all of you. That is the greatest gift anyone could ask for. Margaret lived for another 8 years, long enough to see her great-grandchildren grow, long enough to teach another generation of children in the school, long enough to write down the story of her life with Clayton so that it would never be forgotten. When she finally passed, peacefully in her sleep at the age of 88, she was buried beside Clayton on that hill overlooking the ranch. The Vance Ranch continued to thrive under Cole's management and eventually passed to his son and then to his grandson. The family grew and branched, spreading across Kansas and beyond, but they never forgot the story of how it all began. Every generation heard the tale of Margaret Nelson, the mail-order bride who arrived sick and scared, and Clayton Vance, the cowboy who insisted she rest until her cough quit, and how from that simple act of kindness grew a love story that spanned a lifetime and built a legacy that endured for generations. On the ranch, there stands a plaque near the house, put there by Margaret's children after she passed. It reads, "Here lived Margaret and Clayton Vance, who taught us that love is patient, love is kind, and love insists you rest until the cough quits. Their legacy lives on in all who came after." And so, the story ends where it began, with a cough that would not quit and a cowboy who made sure his bride rested until it did, and the beautiful, enduring love that grew from that simple beginning